Hello, I'm Peter Story. Today I'll be presenting our paper, Awareness, Adoption, and Misconceptions of Web Privacy Tools. This work was a collaboration between Carnegie Mellon University and the School of Information at University of Michigan. Americans say that they want digital privacy, but in fact, adoption of many privacy tools remains low. By helping people adopt effective tools, we might alleviate some of people's concerns. But before we can do that, it's important to understand any barriers to adoption and to understand what misconceptions people have about tools, since misconceptions might lead people to misuse them. In our study, we looked at 5 privacy-centric browsing tools that have been discussed in the literature. We looked at private browsing, VPNs, Tor browser, ad blockers, and antivirus software. Now, antivirus software is more of a security tool than a privacy tool, but we included it because we were interested in whether people would describe privacy protections to it. We wanted to study the extent to which people are aware of these tools and how frequently people use them, how interested people are in preventing specific privacy and security threats, how accurately people can determine whether these tools afford protection from specific privacy and security threats, and what misconceptions, if any, people have about these tools. Now, different than prior work, we measured misconceptions across different combinations of tools and privacy threats, and that data allowed us to identify patterns across tools and threats and to quantify the prevalence of different kinds of misconceptions. We asked participants how effective they thought each tool would be at preventing different privacy threats. Here's an example. We asked, when you browse the web, how effective are the tools at preventing the websites you visit from seeing what physical location you're browsing from, preventing hackers from gaining access to your device, and about 10 other scenarios for 12 privacy threat scenarios total. We asked each participant about 6 threats randomly selected from the 12 total to reduce fatigue. We ran our study using an online survey, and our survey included questions about whether people had heard of or used the 5 tools, about what people thought the efficacy of the tools was, preventing 6 different threats, their interest in preventing those threats, and a free text response about 1 randomly selected tool for each threat, asking people to explain why they described the efficacy the way they did. We gathered our data using the Prolific crowdsourcing platform, and we used Prolific's demographically stratified sample feature to collect a sample of U.S. participants that was representative of the U.S. Census based on age, sex, and ethnicity. We gathered data from 500 participants, and we collected data in August of 2020. We measured participants' awareness of the 5 privacy tools in our study, and we also included a fake tool, Privacy Dog, to gauge participants' honesty. Only 3% of our participants said they'd heard of or used Privacy Dog, which gave us high confidence in the numbers for the other tools. We found that more than 3/4 of participants had heard of or used antivirus software, ad blockers, private browsing, or VPNs. But less than half of participants reported having heard of or used Tor browser, and this suggests an opportunity to increase the public's awareness of Tor browser. We found that some of the tools we studied are already widely used, like antivirus software and ad blockers, which about half of participants reported using the same day they took our survey. But other tools are used less frequently, particularly Tor browser, which less than 1% of participants reported using the day they took our survey. Overall, we observed that about 60% of participants had used at least one of the privacy-focused tools in the past day, and by that I mean a tool other than antivirus software. And nearly 3/4 had used at least one of the privacy-focused tools in the past week. This shows that many people are taking steps to protect their privacy. But as I'll discuss in a few slides, many participants have misconceptions about the protections offered by the tools they're using. We asked each participant about 6 privacy threats, randomly selected from the 12 total shown here. In addition to asking how effective each tool would be at protecting from the threat, we also asked how interested the participant was in preventing the threat. For all threats, we see that over half of participants expressed some interest in preventing it, but people's level of interest varied considerably by threat. The two most security-focused threats, about hackers and card fraud, were of greatest interest to participants. And we also saw strong interest in preventing the two advertiser-related threats. Participants were the least interested in hiding illegal streaming of movies. Now, the most interesting type of question we asked was about what protections participants thought the different tools offered. If someone thinks a tool protects them and it doesn't, they might expose themselves to unnecessary risks. And conversely, if someone thinks a tool doesn't provide a protection that it actually can, they'll probably be less motivated to use that tool. Here's an example of one of the questions we asked about one of the 12 privacy threats. We asked, when you browse the web, how effective are the tools below at preventing the websites you visit from seeing what physical location you're browsing from? Participants could indicate that the tool would be very, somewhat, or not at all effective, or that they were unsure. Now, for this scenario, websites can infer your physical location based on your IP address. So, of these tools, only VPNs and Tor browser can hide your IP address, so we consider them very effective at protecting against this threat, and the other tools not at all effective. The correct responses are indicated with a star in the graph. Now notice that we allow slight underestimates of tools' efficacy, since if the tool is misused, it will provide less protection. So, say for VPNs, we allow someone to indicate that it's either very or somewhat effective in this scenario. Now, more details about this and our other threat scenarios can be found in our paper. So looking at this graph, going from left to right, we see that people did pretty good at identifying the protections offered by VPNs. And they also did okay for antivirus software and ad blockers. But when we get to Tor browser, only about a third are correct, and there's many unsure responses. And perhaps most concerning, we see that for private browsing, more than a third are incorrect, thinking that private browsing is hiding one's physical location. And this is a misconception that has also been found by prior work. Now, although the threat scenario on the last slide showed people answering quite well for VPNs, that isn't true when you look across the 12 different threats. Looking across the threat scenarios, for all tools, participants answered fewer than 60% of the associated questions correctly. And when we look at all 12 threats, we see that for all but one threat, participants answered fewer than half of our assessment questions correctly. In this graph, the 12 threats are on the left, and we see that people did best when asked about preventing friends or family from seeing the websites in their browser history. And we see people have the most difficulty answering about preventing hackers from getting access to their device. So, what do we make of this? I think it shows that people are clearly not experts about these tools, and that many people are uninformed or even misinformed about what these tools actually do. Now, a related question is whether greater experience with tools is associated with more accurate understanding of their protections. In terms of experience, we measured whether people had used the tools, only heard of them, or if they'd never even heard of the tool. Now, ideally, people who are using the tools would have a greater understanding of what they do. And we did find that greater levels of experience are associated with answering more questions correctly. But for VPNs and Tor browser, greater levels of experience were also associated with greater numbers of incorrect responses. And this may be due to a tendency of those with greater levels of experience to mark fewer responses as unsure. Now, those with more experience were more willing to definitively answer questions, but their greater experience wasn't necessarily associated with a more accurate understanding of the tool's protections. So at this point, I've shown that misconceptions about these tools are relatively widespread, and that even people using these tools often hold incorrect beliefs about them. In order to gain a richer understanding of people's misconceptions, I asked them to explain their answers to the threat-related questions. Here's one example. This participant responded that they had indicated private browsing would be very effective in preventing the websites they visit from seeing their physical location they were browsing from, and they answered, because it is called private browsing, which I assume means your browsing is private. Sadly, not true. My collaborators and I read through these responses and we identified relevant themes. So in the next slides, I'm going to summarize 4 of those themes. We have 12 total themes, and you can read about all of those in our paper, and I would encourage you to do so because they're all very interesting. Now, across all tools and threats, we saw participants citing true aspects of tool functionality when explaining incorrect answers. We identified this theme 184 times. People's responses show that they know something about the tools, but their knowledge doesn't prevent them from reaching incorrect conclusions about the tool's protections. This might be due to incomplete mental models about the tools and the threats. Here are some examples. This participant indicated VPNs would be very effective, preventing advertisers from seeing the websites they visit, because VPNs mask one's IP address. Now it's true, VPNs do mask your IP address, but advertisers can track your browsing using many fingerprinting techniques, like cookies or attributes of your browser, so hiding your IP address is not going to prevent advertiser tracking. Another participant indicated that private browsing would be very effective at preventing their employer from seeing browsing done on their employer's Wi-Fi, because private browsing does not keep your history. True, if your employer took your phone and looked at your browser history, they wouldn't see things there if you were using private browsing. But because the employer is operating the Wi-Fi network, they can see traffic that passes through that network. We also identified resignation as a theme, with participants frequently writing that nothing could be done to protect against an entity or that the entity's resources were overwhelmingly powerful. We saw this theme even when there were threats that have effective tools to protect against them. This participant indicated that Tor browser would be not at all effective at preventing observation by the government, because if the government wants to see what you're doing, they'll see it no matter what. And there's a grain of truth to this. If the government is actively investigating you, they may trick you into installing malware on your computer or use an exploit in Tor browser to try to get malware on your computer. But Tor browser is most likely quite effective at preventing mass surveillance, since it's going to disguise your traffic with the traffic of many other users. So in this scenario, we would say that Tor browser is either very or somewhat effective at preventing observation by the government. This other participant indicated that VPNs would be not at all effective at preventing observation by their ISP, and they answered that because they think that their internet service provider can already see everything they do no matter what. And here this is just completely incorrect, because the way the VPN works is by encrypting the traffic as it passes through the ISP's network, and then the traffic is the VPN's protection ends at the VPN endpoint. So unless the ISP is also operating the VPN, you will hide your browsing from your internet service provider. We also saw participants expressing overconfidence in tools protections, writing that tools would provide total protection or anonymity, even though they don't. One participant indicated that antivirus software would be very effective at preventing hackers from gaining access to their device, because it helped prevent any form of virus which might come and affect my data. Now, I wish antivirus software could do this, but it simply can't. So if someone is creating malware, they're going to test it against the most popular kinds of antivirus software. They're only going to pay to distribute their malware if it isn't detected by most common antivirus software. So this other participant wrote that ad blockers would be somewhat effective at preventing the websites they visit from seeing their physical location, because ad blockers will shield you from getting your information harvested. Now, this is just completely untrue, because ad blockers are not going to hide your IP address from the website you're loading. That's sort of the way you load the website, is by it sending the data to your IP address. So unfortunately, this is not a protection ad blockers can provide. And for the last theme I'll talk about today, this is relevant to the 2 security-focused threats. And those were about preventing hackers from getting access to one's device and preventing online stores from misusing one's credit card information. In responses about these threats, we observed 23 cases where participants conflated the privacy protections of private browsing VPNs and Tor browser with security protections. And in people's answers, people describe trying to stay safe from hackers or card fraud by avoiding being noticed or keeping information hidden. This participant wrote that private browsing would be somewhat effective at preventing hackers from gaining access to their device, because it should make your device hard to find by hackers. And unfortunately, private browsing isn't going to do that. If a hacker is going to get on your device, they're either going to exploit your browser or, more commonly, trick you into installing malware, and private browsing isn't going to protect against either of those. Another participant wrote that VPNs would be very effective at preventing hackers from getting access to their device, because it's a virtual network that keeps others from your device. Done well, hackers can't find you. And again, a VPN isn't going to prevent you from downloading and installing malware or protect you from an exploit in your browser. So based on the patterns and misconceptions we identified, we decided on several principles which might help effective adoption of privacy tools. First, we think that messaging should focus on helping people protect themselves from well-defined threats. And this can counter partial knowledge of tools protections that might lead people to conflate, say, security and privacy protections. We also think that messaging should help reassure people of the efficacy of the tools being promoted. And this may help overcome people's resignation about privacy threats. Third, we think that messaging should emphasize the lack of effectiveness of other tools and practices in order to increase people's perception of their susceptibility to privacy threats. People who are already using tools like private browsing might think those tools provide protections that they actually don't. And by emphasizing the limitations of private browsing and other tools, you might be able to increase the adoption of more effective tools like Tor browser. Now, for more details about these recommendations and other recommendations, please check out our paper. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. And as I mentioned, we have more details about all of our results in our paper, so please check that out. If you have any questions or comments, please get in touch. Thank you very much.